Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I am joined by Professor Stephen Notley. And for those that do not know who he is, our Stephen Notley is the Dean of Religious Studies at Pillar College, Newark, New Jersey. Previously, he was the Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins on the New York City campus of Alliance University from 2001 to 2023. He received his PhD from the Hebrew University, where he studied with David Flusser. Notley lived 16 years in Jerusalem with his wife and 4 children, during which time he was the founding chair of the New Testament Backgrounds program at the Jerusalem University College. He has been leading groups of students and lay people to Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean region for over 35 years. He is also the author of many books and articles. He continues collaborative research and publication with Israeli scholars in the fields of historical geography, ancient Judaism, and Christian origins. With that being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Stephen Notley. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay. And today's discussion is based on Professor Notley's book, Jesus' Last Week. He co-edited it with Mark Turnage and Brian Becker. I'll have the link to the book in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, I'd like to take us to my first question. What is the Jerusalem school hypothesis, the Jerusalem school solution to the synoptic problem?
In that book that you made reference to, which was the first volume, there actually were two. There was a follow-up volume dealing with the linguistic environment in first century Judea. In the prologue, I tried to introduce the approach of the Jerusalem school by introducing the primary characters. First was Robert Lindsay, who moved out to Israel before the founding of the state and was very much involved in Bible translation. And as he wanted to have a fresh new translation in Hebrew. And as he began to work to translate, he assumed, like we were all trained, that Mark is the oldest and most primitive gospel. So he assumed that it would be the most Hebraic, because we're typically told that Mark's bad Hebrew, rough Hebrew, is because of Semitic interference. He began to translate Mark's gospel, but he kept encountering Greek structures, Greek phrases that did not go into good Hebrew easily. And what he kept noticing is that when he would encounter a problem he was working in a synopsis, had a synoptic gospel in front of him. And when he encountered problems in Mark's gospel, interestingly enough, in the parallel in Luke would go into very easy Hebrew. It's not supposed to be like that, because we're all told that Luke is more refined Greek, his vocabulary is much better, and that he's probably not Jewish, and so it reflects in the nature of his language. He eventually, this would happen again and again, and eventually drew the conclusion that Luke was not relying upon Mark, because it doesn't make sense for Luke to be relying upon Mark and yet preserving more Hebraisms. His Greek was more Hebraic. So he drew the conclusion that Luke was relying upon Hebraic sources for the construction of his gospel. He knew David Flusser, and so they worked together. And Flusser, again, trained very in sort of the German school, and Mark was the oldest, most primitive gospel, but Flusser and Lindsay worked together. And one day they were looking at a pericope where Jesus talks about that those who have abandoned and left everything will receive 100-fold in the world to come, the future. And in Mark's gospel and Matthew, following Mark, he promises financial or property wealth reward, which is missing in Luke's gospel. Luke talks about, in essence, a community, and the reflecting the idea of bayit is house, not being a physical structure, but a family, and that the Flusser's dilemma of seeing any first century sage offering financial reward for following, for discipleship, was solved in Luke's gospel. And so that began a long collaborative relationship between them. Again, looking at the Gospels from a context of Hebrew language, within also the context of emerging Jewish thought in the Second Temple period. And finally, the third sort of component that I brought into the prologue there was Shmuel Sofrai, who was a great Talmudic historian. And he brought, I think, a lot of sort of the wealth of rabbinic literature to try to read the Gospels. And they began informally sort of meeting regularly and studying the Synoptic Gospels. The conversation was in Hebrew, and they would deal with Jewish sources and look at them, sitting around a dinner table. And before long, their students and friends began to join them. This is a very informal relationship. The term Jerusalem School got coined by David Bivin, and they set up a legal entity. But it really is a set of relationships of Jewish and Christian scholars who study the Gospels, particularly looking at issues of language, Hebraisms in the Greek of the Gospels, and trying to understand Jesus in the Gospels when the context of emerging, developing Jewish ideas. And I think it's a misnomer, a misunderstanding to think that there's some sort of set idea. You actually find a range of opinions on various issues. No one walks in lockstep. Of course, the early scholars have gone to the great reward. So those of us who were their students, young students and friends, have been left to sort of carry on. There's no longer the regular meetings in Jerusalem that there used to be. Those stopped probably 20 years ago. But we have our own individual careers, and we've developed our own students. And so we, you'll hear sometimes them talking about Lucan priority. I would say today, generally, the scholars who are associated with what we're doing would prefer to use the language of Lucan independence, that we don't follow the idea that Mark is the oldest of the Gospels, and that, more importantly, that Luke somehow is relying upon Mark for the writing of his Gospel. The idea of Markan priority is, I would say, 95% of New Testament scholars today accept the idea that Mark was the first, the oldest of the Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke were relying upon Mark's Gospel. I would say that's most of it, I would say not all, but I would say most scholars that associate themselves with the work of the Jerusalem School would question that. We would see Luke is working with non-Markan sources, some of them older than Mark. I would say, and we can explore this in our time together, I would say that there are markers, there are chronological markers in Mark and Matthew's Gospel that make them post-70 in their composition. And interestingly enough, those markers are missing in Luke's Gospel. We don't have the same sort of markers that we find in Mark and Matthew, we find in Luke. That doesn't necessarily mean that Luke is earlier, but he is lacking all of these late chronological markers, like the Decapolis that you have showing up in Mark and Matthew. There was no Decapolis before the Jewish revolt. We don't have any evidence of it, no coinage, no inscriptions, no historical references to the Decapolis until Josephus talks about it in the midst of the Jewish revolt. And interestingly enough, we have Mark and Matthew mentioning the Decapolis, Jesus going to the Decapolis. The cities were there, but the league itself, however we define that, is a late development. And it's an interesting point that Luke lacks that late marker. These are well known in biblical studies. There are chronological markers that mark the time of composition, but are to be distinguished from the time that they're describing. The most famous one in Old Testament is in Genesis 21. It makes reference to the land of the Philistines. And there were no Philistines in Abraham's day. This is the description of Abraham and Avimelech. And Avimelech returns to the land of the Philistines. There are no Philistines in Abraham's day. That is a term that's used in the time of the composition, but not in the time that's being described. And I would say you have the same thing going on in the Gospels. We have other markers that are give us an indication of when those Gospels are being composed. And interesting enough, they don't show up in Luke. The late markers don't show up in Luke. Instead, in Luke's Gospel, we have very interesting early things that only existed at an early period of time. So either Luke, or more probably Luke's source, whatever that source is for the composition of his gospel, possesses some very early material, primitive material, that Luke adopts and uses in the composition of his gospel. So generally, I would say that the one element that would mark the Jerusalem school, one is that Hebrew is an important language for reading the Gospels. I mean, our Gospels, our canonical Gospels, are in Greek, of course, but they possess Hebraisms, Semitisms, not just Semitisms, but Hebraisms, things that are distinguished from Aramaic. You have Hebraisms that exist in the Gospels, and that it's important to read, at times, to read the Gospels through that understanding of language. And the other thing is that Luke is not relying upon Mark in the writing of his gospel, that he has other primitive sources that he's using, probably Hebraic, because of the nature of the language in Luke's writing. His writing is already recognized as being very Hebraic. H.F.D. Sparks wrote a very important article in 1943, a few years before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which he commented that Luke was the most Hebraic of all the Gospels. And he assumed, like many New Testament scholars before him, I would say even some after that Hebrew was a dead language in the first century. So his explanation for Luke's Hebraic language was that they were Septuagintalisms, that he was imitating the Septuagint in the composition of his gospel. It's like I tell my students, it's like when you go into some churches, when they shift and start to pray, they shift into 16th century English, began to speak of these and thous. It has a more holy, sanctified feel to it. So people assume that Luke is composing his gospel and imitating the style of the Septuagint, which is influenced by the Hebrew undergirding it. The problem is twofold. One, Hebrew wasn't a dead language, so we don't need to resort to that. And two, most of these New Testament scholars who use that argument don't recognize the fact that we have non-Septuagintal Hebraisms in the gospel. In the second volume that followed the one that you talked about here, I did an article on non-Septuagintal Hebraisms in Luke's gospel, and it demonstrate that however we explain the Hebrew there, he's not using biblicisms. He's not using expressions that are coming out of the Septuagint, but it's part of a living language environment. Unfortunately, many New Testament scholars, a lot of New Testament scholars do not, we're the only discipline that still sort of holds on to this idea that Hebrew was a dead language in the first century. And that Jesus was only spoke Aramaic, didn't speak Hebrew. We're the only discipline. Other disciplines don't have this problem, and it affects how we read the Gospels and how we interpret them. So I would say that would be I know that's a long answer to a short question, but that would be the general approach to the Jerusalem school, is trying to understand Jesus in Hebraic background, understand him as part of emerging Judaism, and third, challenging the general consensus in New Testament scholarship that sees Luke relying upon Mark for the composition of his gospel.
So now I'd like to ask you about the pre-Lucan sources that you're referring to.
Right.
What are those sources? What do the Jerusalem school hypothesis proponents think about those sources?
Again, I'll repeat, we have different. If you had David Biven here, he would explain it one way. I would just generally say I'm not sure whether they're written. I would think that some of them are written. Others of them are probably oral, gets it from oral tradition as well. I don't know whether he's working with multiple sources. I think it's difficult to identify precisely what are the sources to Luke's gospel. But I think what you can say is that they've been heavily in. I mean, Luke starts off in the first 4 verses in this is also Sparks's observation, starts off in a very polished, refined Greek, and then shifts to a very Semiticized, and I would say Hebraicized Greek that persists through his gospel. What's interesting and is sometimes overlooked, it continues in the first 15 chapters of Acts as well, a more Hebraic Semitic style. And in chapter 16, where if we assume the author, and if it's Luke, or assume the author starts speaking about himself and Paul as we start what we call the we sections, suddenly there's a shift in language and he returns to his more polished, refined Greek style. So I think this is an indication that that Luke has access to early sources. And again, whether they're multiple sources, whether they're written and oral, we can have a discussion, a debate about it. I think it's clear that there are indications that at least some of them are written down, just because of the way that they're structured. But I can't identify exactly what they are. Again, I can identify the nature of them, that they're early. And they're, interestingly enough, they're oftentimes these elements are not present in Mark and Matthew. Let me give you an example of that. When Jesus is being held and he's being questioned by Pontius Pilate in Luke's gospel, when Pontius Pilate hears that he is from Galilee, he immediately sends him to Herod Antipas, who's in Jerusalem at the time. That's a unique element in the Passion narrative that doesn't show up in Mark and Matthew. And he says, because he's in his jurisdiction, that distinction of the jurisdiction between Galilee and Judea disappears in 39 and is never occurs again. So if Luke is writing, as often said, he's sort of detached from the real setting and he's writing in 80, 90, 100, he's giving us a point that has absolutely zero theological or political value to it. It's a little bit of minutia of the jurisdictional difference between Galilee and Judea that never existed again after 39. And again, that's just one example of the types of early bits of valuable information. He gives us all kinds of information in his gospel about Jewish life and faith that is missing in the other gospels. the naming of the son on the 8th day. It's John the Baptist is the first Jewish boy who's recorded to be named at his circumcision on the 8th day. This is a universal Jewish tradition, but it's not a biblical tradition. It's something that develops in the post-biblical era. And we have, of course, John the Baptist and Jesus. We have other elements like that where Luke uniquely gives us these bits and pieces of information, witnesses to Jewish life and faith. Where is he getting all this information? He's not getting it from Mark and Matthew. He's giving us information that's coming from his sources. Now, again, whether it's 1, 2, 3 sources, whether it's eyewitness accounts or written sources, I don't know. I don't know exactly. I haven't defined it as to, I've got some parts come from this source, some parts come from that source. I don't push it that far. I just speak in general terms that Luke has access to Hebraic sources that are not Mark. I tend to read, if Luke is the companion of Paul, if you're looking for a window of time, I tend to view, if Paul's in house arrest in Caesarea, for a couple of years, perhaps Luke, I'm just general speculation, perhaps Luke had time to travel the country, to interview people, to speak to them. He gives us very, very important little bits of information that generally he gets no political or theological traction out of them. They are just reflections. They're little gems that reflect very early observations on life and faith in the latter decades of the Second Temple period. Okay.
So if Luke has the first gospel, what are the implications of that on any attempts to reconstruct the historical Jesus? How does that change how one looks at the historical Jesus?
Oh, I think it becomes a watershed. I think it means that you typically, oftentimes scholars will view Luke as just a theological reworking of the, tertiary, even reworking of the gospel. And I think the role of the Jewish people in the death of Jesus is different in Luke's gospel. It presents a different narrative there. And I can say that what you tend to find is a heightened tension, if I can use the terminology, between the church and the synagogue as Christianity moves forward. And I think those tensions find their way into Mark and Matthew's telling of the story. I wrote an article in the Jerusalem Perspective, David Bivens' Jerusalem Perspective, on anti-Jewish tendencies in the Synoptic Gospels, where I went through pericope by pericope, demonstrating that there is a growing heightened tension between Jesus and the Jewish people in the Gospels. And I think it's an important thing to trying to ask the historical question: why, what was the source of the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leadership? Who was involved in the handing of Jesus over to the Romans? Something that's unthinkable. Most people think of it in terms of being Pharisees, that they're involved in all of this. That's something that's unthinkable in rabbinic terms. And Pharisaic understanding, to hand a fellow Jew over to the Romans and it leading to their death is considered an unforgivable sin. The whole idea of who the friends and foes of Jesus changes dramatically. I think there's some differences in terms of our understanding of the content of Jesus's message. I think for me, when I'm looking at the parables, I've done work on parables. I did work with Deciphering, and we collected 456 of the earliest Jewish parables from the literature of the Tanaim, and it had never been done before, where there was an anthology of the earliest Jewish story parables. We gathered 456 of them. I translated them, and we annotated them. One of the interesting things in those is that we find that Jewish parables are not told ever in Aramaic. If you pick up any New Testament book, they'll talk about Jesus' Aramaic parables. Find me one. They don't exist. And it's a sociolinguistic trait in Jewish tradition to tell parables in Hebrew. And yet New Testament scholars they feel free to dismiss, Jesus' Hebraic language and his teaching, and to speak of Aramaic parables. And that starts influencing how the lens through which we start reading those parables and the message of the parables, what they have to say. So I think once you move away from the fact that Mark is the oldest, most reliable gospel, is usually how it's said, I think all bets are off. You have to look at it pericope by pericope. I'm not a simplistic scholar. I'm a critical scholar. Doesn't mean that Luke can't be looked at critically in terms of what he's preserving for us. But I would say more often than not, he preserves a more primitive stage in the development of the gospel accounts. I'd say I would follow Flusser on this, that Matthew, and this is where it sometimes gets a bit confusing for those on the outside. Matthew is heavily influenced by Mark, but in those instances, he also has other sources, not Q. To have Q, you need Markan priority. So if you don't have Markan priority, you're not talking about Q. You're talking about other sources. But if Matthew, in those instances where Matthew is not influenced by Mark, but has access again to another source, sometimes even his accounts, his sayings, are even better than Luke's. So it's not a static sort of looking at the relationship of the Gospels. It's a very fluid thing, that the dynamic situation in which you have to open the pericope to look at it, to examine how they relate to one another in terms of their preservation of either the saying or the account, and you look at them in a different way. And even in our translation, I would say Markan priority, has its fingerprints all over New Testament scholarship. If you look at the end of in Luke 6, the story of the man with the withered hand, I'll just give you an example. And again, we could spend all night with this, but you have the example with the man with the withered hand, and Jesus has him stretch out his hand. It's a very the whole account's an interesting one to look at in the context of Jewish thought. But when it gets to the end, those who are witnessing there are amazed at what has happened. They're shocked. They're dumbfounded. It isn't how they expected it to happen. And in 6:11, Luke 6:11, it says that they're filled with anoia. Every translation I know says they're filled with rage, anger. Oh, never in the history of the Greek language, never in the history of the Greek language does the Greek term mean that. Doesn't mean anger, rage, anything like that. It's bafflement, it's confusion. But because that is the ending of the story in Mark and Matthew, the New Testament translators translate Luke's gospel through the lens of Markan priority. And they, if I can say it, mistranslate. And they distort the response of the crowd. The crowd, those who are standing there are not, they're not full of anger or rage. They're confused because they did not expect the man to be healed on the Sabbath. Of course, my students, I usually ask them the side question. I said, all right, who broke the Sabbath here? And, there's nothing in the written or in the oral law that forbids a man from sticking out his hand on Shabbat. And there's nothing in the written or oral law about Jesus praying on Shabbat. He doesn't touch the man. He doesn't lay hands on him. He does nothing to transgress the Shabbat. The one who does work on the Shabbat is God himself. And in that miracle, it affirms what Jesus is saying in that text about the value of the human individual, such that God would do labor, would heal the man on Shabbat, and they have to go away and sort of process that. But there's no anger, there's no rage, and yet scholars feel the freedom to read the Greek text in a way that is never in the history of the Greek language read that way. And so this is the kind of things we get all the time in reading, is that this tendency to sort of read Luke's gospel through the lens of Markan priority. And what happens is that they misread Luke. And I would say there are instances as well in which they misunderstand the content of Jesus's teaching. And as I mentioned, I think it becomes most critical when we start asking the questions: what leads to the death of Jesus? What are the issues that are there? Who are the friends and foes of Jesus? Why are they opposed to him? Who are they? And those issues are different depending on which synoptic gospel you lean on.
What's your take on Matthew's gospel? Do you place it after Luke and before Mark, or do you place it after Luke and Mark?
I'll be honest, the question of order, for me, is not as important as dependency. If you work in text criticism, you know that you can have a late manuscript, a late recension, but it's relying upon an earlier source, and it can give you the best, even though it's the latest copy we have, it actually can give us the best reading. So the question of the ordering, I don't think, is always the most critical question. I tend not to use the term Lucan priority because people think that I've seen, Martians, green men, because it's such an unusual thing to even question Markan priority. But what I can say is that I think Matthew knows and uses Mark. I think that's fairly clear. Most scholars would agree that you find more of Markan influence in Matthew's gospel, and I wouldn't argue with that. I think that's true. But I think there are times where Matthew has access to non-Markan material that indicate that it is to be preferred sometimes even over Luke. And that was Flusser's observation as well.
I want to come back to Mark and the more Semitisms that are in Luke that you've been mentioning. What do you make of Robert Lindsay's work on Mark in terms of the idea of a Hebraic proto-Mark specifically?
He tried to speak of a sort of an earlier stage than something that's earlier than Mark, but that is used by, in other words, what he would call a proto-Mark that was used by Luke. I don't really, for me, I don't, it may or that may be, there may be I think there probably was something approximating a gospel that looked like a gospel that Luke is relying on, and not just there may have been more than one version. Luke talks about, there being other accounts, whether that's proto Mark, I mean, what I will say is that when Lindsay wrote out his ideas early on, they changed in time. Like any good scholar, you get more information there. And of course, to be honest, I'm more of a student of Flusser than I am of Lindsay. I mean, he was my mentor. So I take a less, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, but a less wooden approach to, I think sometimes these issues are a bit more dynamic and not as rigid as wooden. And so in terms of like identifying, outlining what exactly is the proto-mark or this proto-gospel that's being used by Luke. I know that's Lindsay's idea that, you had this very early gospel that's being used by Luke and also being used by Mark, that Mark likes to always change things up, and that he is in the process of sort of reworking that proto-mark. I read it, I understand what he's trying to do there. Sometimes I think this material's maybe just a bit beyond our ability to set a fixture in terms of how we're understanding the shape and the content of these early documents.
So now I'd like to ask you about the fig tree. We look at the fig tree in Mark and Luke. You indicate that Luke's version is clearly more primitive than Mark's version, even though, as you mentioned earlier, that a lot of scholars would try to say that Mark is first. They'll say that Luke was redacting Mark's version of the fig tree.
Okay. So I've written on that in a couple different places. For me, there's no question that Luke preserves the more primitive form of the parable, and he preserves both the Semitisms, Hebraisms that get lost in Mark and Matthew. He also, I think, to understand what's going on there, you have to understand also a bit of botany, fig trees in the land of Israel. Not all fig trees are alike. Jesus, he concludes the synoptic apocalypse, or however we want to call that, Luke 21, Mark 13, Matthew 24. You have this long discourse that leads to the destruction, a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't, like a good prophet, prophecy tends to be cyclical. And so he doesn't leave them without hope. So he says, when you see Jerusalem trampled under the feet of the Gentiles, he says, lift your head, for your redemption draws near. I think that's the voice of hope, that not all is lost. And then he punctuates it. He describes it with this small parable. Learn the lesson of the fig tree. When you see it put forth, you know that the summer is near. Okay. Now, Mark and Matthew have leaves, and that would be another example of where the translators translate Luke through Mark's eyes. There are no leaves in Luke's text, and that is not what's indicated. That's not what was intended. Sorry. Jesus does not intend leaves, because the first thing that comes out in figs in the land of Israel, they also exist in Ephesus. I've seen them there as well. So let's say in the Eastern Mediterranean, is the little fruit, the pog. If I was doing a lecture, I'd have a picture of it so you could actually visualize it. The first thing that comes out are these little bulbs of fruit. In Hebrew, we call them a pog, and they're bitter green, and a lot of times you'll see people eating them. In Israel, if you go visit there today, you'll see Arabs sometimes eating them. They'll eat this sour fruit, and people like them. But the point of the parable was when you see it put forth, in other words, put forth this green, bitter fruit, you know that the summer is near. Now, the word summer in Hebrew, kites, is not only the season, but it's also, we find it in biblical references, biblical occasions. It is the expression for the summer fruit. The quintessential summer fruit is the fig. And so Jesus is basically saying, learn this lesson. Learn the lesson of the fig tree. When you see it put forth the bitter fruit, you know that in time, the summer fruit will be there, the sweet fruit. In other words, times of bitterness are followed by times of sweetness. And I will say that in the Midrashim, they actually compare the plagues in Egypt with the bitter fig, with the pog. And so Jesus is picking up on that theme, talking about, again, when he says summer, he means the summer fruit, just like we find in the Hebrew Bible on a number of occasions, Amos and other places where it makes reference to, and it just uses the word kites in Hebrew, the summer fruit, but it means the fruit. And that is the essence of Jesus's message of the parable. He's trying to leave them with a message of hope. They're going to see a lot of terrible things happen, but not to lose hope, that times of bitterness are followed by times of sweetness. And the way that he exemplifies that is this little simple parable of the parable of the fig tree, that when you see it put forth this bitter fruit, in time, it becomes sweet. And that is to be honest, in this instance, I would suggest that none of the evangelists actually get the gist of the parable. It's one that's embedded in Hebrew. It's embedded in local agriculture. And I mean, we can have a discussion about the profile of the evangelists, but I'm not sure this is one of those occasions where I think all three evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't grasp. They're preserving what they have, but they don't grasp, because you can see others of the Gospels talking about the second coming, the kingdom of God. They're all talking. They're trying to figure out what in the world is he talking about, and the point isn't any of those. It's not the second coming or any of that. It has to do with this idea, which is, again, it's not unique to Jesus, this idea of using the fig, but that times of bitterness are followed by times of sweetness. And Jesus uses it here with his Hebraic use of the summer kites to indicate not the season, but the summer fruit. So again, this is one of those occasions where you have to look at each gospel, see what they're working with, try to make an evaluation in terms of what they're grasping in terms of Hebraic backgrounds or physical settings, various things that help us to sort of, to measure how the story is being told. So it's not a simplistic thing of saying, okay, Luke always gets it right. Luke, no, you have to, each time you open all three synoptic gospels and you look at them, you evaluate them, you try to look at how they're dealing with the material. But I would say, more often than not, Luke gives us a reading that resonates better within a Hebraic language environment and reflects something of emerging Jewish thought.
So what do you think, let me rephrase. What would you say the top, say, two issues that you like to note about market priority? And my second part to that question is, often when market priority is assumed, it tends to be blended together with the idea that Luke is written for a Gentile audience primarily, and so it's often understood that goes together with dating it later. So what are the issues with all that logic?
Okay, what's the first one again? What particularly about Markan priority?
What are your top? What would you say are the top two issues with Markan priority? That was my first part of the question.
What are my top issues with Markan priority? I think the difficulty with Markan priority is the fact that it assumes it's not just the question. Again, it's not the question of ordering; it's the question of dependency, and that's the problem. Is that they assume that Luke is relying upon Mark. I don't know of a single text where that's obligated. You can assume it. You can assume, which is what they do. They assume Luke is using Mark, and now let's see where Luke is different from Mark. This is where he's redacting. This is where he's altering for his audience. But it works on an assumption that I don't think is a valid one, and so that's all where I'm saying. I'm not using the term Lucan priority in the sense that I'm not trying to reverse the tables on that. I'm saying Luke is working independently of Mark, and we should not read Luke through a Markan lens. I mean, I've given you a couple of examples today in terms of language and how we read his gospel. That's wrong. It's just mistaken. That you can't. Luke is not. He's not dependent upon Mark. If you want to assume it, bavakasha, as they say in Hebrew, you're welcome to. But I don't know that that's. I don't. I think it'll always come out less than ideal, and I think that would be my is not to read Luke through a Markan lens, which is what happens in the vast bulk of scholarship, and I would I think it becomes particularly critical from a historical standpoint when we start looking at the Passion narrative and trying to ask what is happening here, what's driving the leadership to do an unthinkable thing in Jewish terms, and who are they? I think primarily it's the temple establishment, the Sadducees, who don't believe in an afterlife. So they don't have to worry about an unforgivable sin in the next world. They don't, the Pharisees are a completely different situation. So I think the question of who is involved in the death of Jesus and what motivates them and why they do what they do, I think is very different in the Synoptic Gospels. And I think Mark presents, if I can say it, a more hostile environment. And I think that would be one thing that I struggle with in terms of Markan priority. I don't know. I can't think of anything else in terms of off the top of my head. I'm very much into parables. I work in parables, and parables are the most indicative form of teaching for Jesus. But most people don't realize that all Jewish parables are in Hebrew, only come from the land of Israel. Even Babylonia, the great area of Jewish thinking that gave us the Babylonian Talmud, does not produce a single parable. All parables are in Hebrew. They're local to the land of Israel. And this is, it is a, and those are things that indicate something about Jesus. And if we want to understand the message of Jesus, the parables are essential. And it's very interesting that Mark preserves the least number of parables in the Synoptic Gospels. Notice they disappear in John's Gospel and Paul because they don't resonate with a Gentile audience. That sort of goes to your question earlier about Luke writing for the Gentiles. And yet it's interesting that Luke is the one that preserves this collection of materials that have nothing to do with the Gentiles. The earliest indication of the limits on a Sabbath day journey, which again isn't a biblical thing, it's a post-biblical development, is in the book of Acts. If Luke is writing for a Gentile audience, he's giving us all kinds of information that is irrelevant for his audience. He also presents Jesus functioning as a first century sage in a very interesting fashion. That would be another text to open and look more carefully at, and that's Jesus in Nazareth. I think Mark changes the focus of that particular narrative, and if I can say it, distorts what's going on. You have Jesus doing something, as you probably know, this is our earliest account, earliest witness of the reading of the Haftarah, the reading of the prophets in the synagogue. That is in Luke, in Luke 4 in Nazareth. And Jesus, he blends together two passages of scripture with, and Isaiah 61 and Isaiah 58. He brings one line of Isaiah 58 and sort of interjects it into this citation of Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. And I've read various scholars say, oh, Luke was mistaken, Luke was sloppy, Luke didn't know the text because he's misquoting, he's bringing this line. They don't realize this is a very sophisticated thing Jesus is doing, and only Luke preserves it. Only in those two passages in the entire Hebrew Bible do we have the phrase Ratzon LaAdonai, and it's a part of a midrashic process, a hermeneutical process to combine otherwise independent texts because they have in them analogous, congruent, analogous phrases or words that only appear there, and to bring them together and to create a message. So in essence, Jesus's sermon is done by combining these two passages by virtue of the fact that only in those two passages in the Hebrew Bible do you have the phrase Ratzon LaAdonai. It's a very sophisticated text. It has no traction for a Gentile world. It is based in Hebrew, I might add, because that connecting phrase disappears in Aramaic and in the Greek Septuagint. It has to be done in Hebrew. So there goes Fitzmeyer's idea that, oh, Jesus was reading from the Targum. It can't work. It can only work in Hebrew. So it's not for a Gentile audience. I don't know. He has why is he including all of these things from Jewish life? That would be more of an accusation of John in the Last Supper when he removes all the Passover elements because his audience isn't interested in the Passover. I don't see that for Luke's gospel, that he somehow is again. From a language standpoint, it's widely recognized. It's long been recognized that Luke is the most Hebraic of the Gospels, not just Semitic, but Hebraic. Why is he doing such a thing? Why is he taking Mark's Greek Gospel and transposing and making it into a Hebraic Gospel, and for the purpose of writing to Gentiles? It's nonsensical. That's not how the direction the church has moved. Christianity has slowly moved. We speak of the parting of the ways. I think it was slower than people suggest, and I don't think it was as consistent as people suggest. I think in different places that separation happened more slowly, but still there is a general tendency, especially as Gentiles come into this Jewish movement, that they slowly began to part ways. So why is Luke supposedly writing in 80 or 100 or whatever date they want to put on it, somehow putting as fixtures throughout his gospel Hebraisms, matters of Jewish life and faith that we don't even have in the Jewish sources? The first time they appear is there. I'm collecting it's a little discipline we do. I have a friend of mine, former student, and we collect a list. I call them signs of life, but we've collected about 40 or 50 elements that are the first evidence of Jewish life and faith, and they show up in the Gospels. And more often than not, they appear either in Luke's gospel or Matthew's gospel, never in Mark, interestingly enough. Mark doesn't possess them. So they are elements that gain no traction with a Gentile audience. So I don't, it doesn't make sense to me in terms of what I'm reading, this idea that Luke somehow is bent on writing his gospel for the Gentiles. I think that comes out of a misunderstanding of the relationship of Mark and Matthew. They start with Mark as the base, and wherever Luke is different, then then they try to read into and understand the motive for his redaction. But I think it starts on the wrong foot.
Yeah, so your point basically that you've been making throughout the discussion is it's not, in other words, it's not as simple as stating
No,
order. It's more complicated than that. There's a lot more going on than that. In other words, there's more going on than that which we have access to.
right,
Texts that are lost that we cannot recover. We can only guess what they looked like, which
correct.
complicates the situation. So that being said, so for my next question, when you look at Paul's Eucharist, because and the Greek of his Eucharist looks a lot like the formulation we see in Luke. Um, that's been noted by many scholars. Do you think would you say that supports the idea, since Paul's wording is closer to Luke, that there's a connection, some kind of connection between the two, and that may or may not support an early dating of Luke?
First of all, it's a very interesting subject. I also wrote an article on that. I don't know if it's in that volume or the next one. Maybe in this one, I wrote on the Eucharistic blessings at the Last Supper. I don't think the simple answer to your question is I don't think that tells us anything about the relationship of Luke and Paul. I've written on this. I think Luke is the only one. First of all, there's a textual issue that the latter part of in Luke's gospel, he starts off with a cup, then he has bread, and then there's an added portion, what they call the longer Lucan version. And what you made reference to, it's that added portion that comes right out of Paul's reading in 1 Corinthians. And I think what happens is the scribes struggled with something. They struggle with the fact that in Mark and Matthew, the order is bread and wine. In Luke's gospel, it's wine, it's the cup, then it's the bread. In Jewish tradition, the only exceptions that we have in all is in either in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in Mark and Matthew, where you have a reversal of the cup and the bread. That's the only place. Luke preserves Jesus celebrating the Passover in the traditional Jewish order and it actually is the Kiddush. It's what comes before the meal. You have the blessing over the cup, then the bread, then you have the meal. According to Shmuel Safrai, in the days of the Second Temple period, there were only 2 cups, not 4 like they have today. That's a post-70 development. And but in Luke's gospel, he preserves here a cup and a bread. And then I think the scribes, later Greek scribes, struggled with the fact that Jesus had reversed the order that was being used in the church. All churches I know have it as bread and wine. I'm a good Anglican, if that's not an oxymoron. And so it's always cup and it's always the bread and the cup. However, in the Passover, as Jesus would have been there, it would have been cup, then bread, then they'd have the meal, and they would have had a second cup to mark the Passover, the special occasion. I think the scribes knew of the second cup, and they took, it's almost verbatim. I think there's one word variation of the text from 1 Corinthians. They took it in block, added it into Luke's gospel, so we get the longer Lucan version. So you have a cup, bread, and cup. But I think that's what motivated them. I think the best manuscripts, the best readings is the shorter Lucan version. And when Jesus lifts the bread up and said, "This is my body," he's not talking about identification. It's not a identification of himself with the bread in the way that some theologies would read it. I think he's talking about the breaking. I think it's yet another hint of his being broken, that he's been sort of preparing them for what is going to happen. So he lifts the bread and says, "This is my body, but the hand of the one who betrays me is on the table." So there's not a second cup. The portion from 1 Corinthians 11 is not part of that. And I might add, by the way, Paul agrees with Luke that the order is as Luke has it. Why? Because he says he takes the bread, and after supper, he takes the cup. In other words, he leaves off the first cup of the Kiddush, just gives us the bread, then says, "And I received this after the meal." He took the cup. So he's preserving the second cup, which is fair enough, but he doesn't have Jesus reversing the order of the cup and the bread like we have in Mark's gospel, like we have in Matthew's gospel. And my suggestion, that's clear. In my opinion, there's no question about that Luke preserves the meal as it would have progressed, with the cup and the bread, again, part of the Kiddush before the meal. I've suggested that what's driving both the change of order at Qumran and in Mark and Matthew's gospel has to do with their messianology, their Christology, whatever term you want to use for it, because only at Qumran and in early Christian Christology do we see Jesus as a type of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, when he comes out in Genesis, remember, he comes out, what does he bring? He brings out gifts of bread and wine, which is the order they do it at Qumran. And of course, at Qumran, there were some who believed that the Messiah, the priestly Messiah, would be none other than Melchizedek. And I think if you read the Epistle to Hebrews, you have this layering of this idea of Melchizedek. And I think what is being reflected here in the changing of the order is a deeply held belief that Jesus was, a priest on the, priestly Messiah on the order of Melchizedek. And those two elements are unique in all of Jewish writings: the change of order of the blessings and this association of Melchizedek with the Messiah. And I don't think it's an accident. I actually think they're connected. And Luke knows none of it. He just preserves Jesus, keeping the normal Jewish practice of wine and bread. Sorry, that was a long answer for another short question. I'm not trying to stall. It's just sometimes these things are a little bit complicated.
Oh no, as I've said before to another guest of the show, I like long answers. I'm totally fine with it. Yeah. We do have a couple of super chat questions, so I'm gonna take them. I Fish and Atai, thank you for your super chat. What sources did Luke use if he didn't follow Mark? I don't know if you feel like answering that again, but I guess I Fish and Atai wasn't listening earlier at the time.
I don't know. I look old, but I'm only 70. I wasn't there. So I think the question of whether they're oral or written is a debate. and what sources he's using. Again, my preference is to see Luke. Not preference. My idea. I wouldn't die for it, but I think Luke may have had a couple of years while Paul was in house arrest and he had access to the land. The subject we haven't touched on here, I'd say for the last 15 years, 20 years, I've become well known for historical geography. And I can tell you from a historical geographical standpoint, Luke hands down is better than Mark and Matthew. He intimately knows the land. He doesn't call the body of water the Sea of Galilee. That is a Christian name. Only appears in Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke doesn't know it. Luke knows the Jewish name for it, the Lake of Gennesaret. And he never calls it a sea. It's not a sea. It's not a thalassa. It's a limne. It's freshwater lake. He knows it as fresh water. Thalassa is brackish water. Mark, Matthew, and so I think Luke actually knew. I think he stepped foot in the land. I think he talked to people during this period of time. And so whether they're oral sources or he had access to written sources, I don't know. I can't speak to that. So, right.
That's interesting because typically they'll try to say that other scholars will try to say that Luke gets the geography either equally as wrong as Mark does, or even gets it even worse, gets it even more wrong than Mark does. But you're saying it's quite the other way around.
I don't want to brag, but I had matched my New Testament historical geography. I lived there 16 years. We found Bethsaida, which is another interview, and on the shore of Sea of Galilee. The last 10 years, I don't think anybody questions that now. And it came through a careful reading of text and then archaeology. I worked with Anson Rady on the Sacred Bridge, so I had to deal seriously with issues of physicality. I would challenge anybody who suggests that Luke's historical geography is less than Mark. That Luke has just the Sea of Galilee alone. I did an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature on the name, the Sea of Galilee, and I dealt with that. I didn't deal with the synoptic relationship. I just dealt with the name, that the place name is unknown anywhere, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, until the Byzantine period, except for Matthew, Mark, and John. It is a Christian name that it doesn't appear anywhere. And it only appears when Byzantines start influencing language. And it's never, ever called a sea, whether in Latin or in Greek. It's never called a sea except for Matthew, Mark, and John. By sea, I mean the Greek term thalassa, which means brackish water. Luke is the only one who correctly tells us that it's Greek. I mean, that it's limne, which is fresh water. So he knows something the others don't know. He also doesn't mess up with the geography. You have the beginning of what's usually called the Great Omission, where Luke supposedly knows Mark, but somehow skips Mark 6:45 to 8:26. No one can figure out why he leaves it out. Luke's Great Omission, because it has women, it has Gentiles, all the things that Luke should be interested in. He skips over it. And people don't recognize that whole Markan block begins with a geographical lapse. They set out to cross over to the other side, to Bethsaida, and Jesus walks out on the water in Matthew and Mark, not in Luke, but he walks out there, and they end up back at the plain of Gennesaret. They do a U-turn on the lake. They start a whole journey up into Tyre and Sidon, the only time Jesus is outside of the land of Israel. And they come down through the Decapolis, again, a place name that never appears any place before the Jewish revolt. And then they eventually make their way to Bethsaida. When they get there, then Luke's gospel, they set out and they arrive where they were supposed to be going without disruption. So this whole sort of literary block matches a geographical U-turn and a huge circuitous journey. The geography helps us at times also to unpack the relationship of the Gospels. But I can say clearly, I mean, that this is an area that I specialize in historical geography. There is no way Mark should be preferred over Luke when it comes to historical geography. Luke knows what he's doing. Okay.
I Fish and Ty, thank you for another super chat. Can you speak on the cross inscription at Bethsaida?
Cross inscription. I assume I assume you're meaning the inscription. I don't know anything about a cross inscription. I know about the. I'll comment on we found 3 inscriptions in the. First of all, we dug and everyone thought we were crazy in 2016. We started, and my thing was a careful reading of text. If I can say it, I hope I don't offend archaeologists who are listening here, but archaeologists don't always read well, okay? And I would say the other side of it, historians and people in text don't get out enough. So I live in a camp where both sides I find these dynamics. But as everyone knows, since 1987, there was another site for Bethsaida, and I wrote in the early 2000s and challenged that. And in Near Eastern archaeology, I wrote an article called Et Tel, which is the other site, is not Bethsaida. It caused a bit of a firestorm because nobody was really seriously questioning it. It led to a few debates, and eventually the other excavator said, our site is Bethsaida because it's the only one excavated. If you think it's someplace else, go dig. So we did. And we began, we did a shovel survey in 2014. In 2016, we began excavating. Again, most people thought we were crazy until the second season, 2017, we came upon Roman level. According to the other excavator, we were supposed to be under four meters of water under the lake because he has a fishing village that's supposedly 3 kilometers from the lake shore. So he has to raise the lake to get up there. And so we came upon Roman remains, a Roman bathhouse, which fits Josephus's description that the village of Bethsaida was transformed into a polis, into a city by Herod Philip. So it fit the dynamic. We definitely have a Jewish fishing village, lots of artifacts that demonstrate that. But we also have evidence of urbanization, which uniquely fits the description of Josephus about Bethsaida when it was renamed Julius. So one of the things we did not expect is that we found a large lost basilica, a Byzantine basilica. There were some pilgrimage traditions about a church built over the house of Peter and Andrew. When I first suggested to Moti Aviam that this was our church, we found early evidence of a church. He said, "What church is this?" I said, "I think it's the Church of Willibald, a Bavarian bishop." And when he sent off the note to his Israeli counterparts, they all said, "No, Notley's wrong. That Willibald was confused. He was really talking about Capernaum. There's no church there." Well, I can tell you there's a large basilica that got lost, and we dug under the apse and found first century house. I can't say it's Peter's house. There's no plaque that says Peter slept there. It's like we talk about the limits and what we can know in the sources of the gods. You can only go so far in terms of what you can know. And I don't try to move beyond what I can demonstrate or know. But one of the interesting things is we found in 2022 in August, last day of the dig, of course, we found in the sacristy, we found the north side of the church, we found a large inscription, a medallion inscription that was dedicated to the benefactor who had paid for the flooring, the mosaics of the floor there. And it In the middle of it, it mentions him. His name is Constantine, not an emperor. He's a local figure. And it seeks intercession from the chief of the apostles and the keeper of the keys of heaven. Now, anyone who reads the New Testament knows at least the keepers of the keys. This is Matthew 16, resonates with Peter. Of course, in Christian tradition, Peter becomes the chief of the apostles. But this inscription actually is the first archaeological evidence for that belief. We have it in literature, but we don't have anything in archaeology, any inscriptions until this one. And it's an interesting one. I'll be lecturing on it in Washington in May on the inscription, sort of doing a deep dive into it. But it's what I can say today about it is that Peter is not associated with very many Byzantine churches in Palestine, Byzantine Palestine. And when he is associated with the church, it's because he shows up in the Gospels. And the only reason we would have Peter being referenced in a basilica on the shores of the Sea of Galilee is because of the John 1:44 that Peter, Andrew, and Philip came from Bethsaida. So for many people, that was the clinching. It was a smoking gun that we have, in fact, Bethsaida. I would say the archaeology is overwhelming. In October, we demonstrated the beginning through sealed loci, sort of sealed spaces, coinage that demonstrates the beginning of Bethsaida, of this settlement anyway, began in the Hasmonean kingdom, probably into the second, beginning of the 1st century BC. Like all of our other ones, Capernaum, Magdala, they all began as part of Hasmonean expansion to the north. And so Bethsaida is part of that. So our beginnings began at that time and continues on up to the 3rd century. It's abandoned for a short period, probably because of water. But for me, the convincing part was the finding of the bathhouse that fit so well with the witness of Josephus. He only speaks of Bethsaida one place in all of his writings to describe the transformation of Bethsaida into Julius, the renaming of it as Julius, and the transformation from being a come, from a village, to a polis, to a city. I guess I don't know anything about a cross, but I assume that's what he's referring. If not, I'm sorry, I missed the mark. Or it's some other excavation that has a cross.
Well, he wrote this cross, and it has a circle at the center of the cross. It was founded by Richard Freund and Rami Av.
That's the other. That's up on the. That's Et Tel. That's not our site. That's the other Bethsaida. I would say pseudo Bethsaida, but I don't want to get censored here. That's the other site of. That's an interesting one. They supposedly found a cross that's before the Common Era. So I don't know how you have a cross. I mean, I don't know how they can, but they do. They speak about a cross before Jesus was born. So I don't understand. I've never really understood about how they were able to interpret that to be a cross. I mean, it can be something that approximates it, but I don't have any comments on that. All I can say is that I encounter New Testament scholars all the time who come up to me. They don't apologize, but they say, okay, you've convinced us. 10 years ago, people thought we were crazy. Now the evidence is so overwhelming. I don't know. We have a Jewish settlement on the lakeshore in all of the sources, Josephus, New Testament. It's a fishing village. You don't build a fishing village 3 kilometers from the lakeshore. And so I think today, I don't know anybody. I mean, if they do, that's fine. I don't have any problems with it, but I don't know any serious scholarship today that's still advocating that Et Tel, the other site that Rami has overseen, that it's Bethsaida. I don't encounter anyone saying that. So,
For my final question, do you or similar kind of evidence about the Semitisms in Luke that you've spoken of during our discussion today? Do you also see some of that occurring in Acts at all?
Yes, it's quite well known that the language shifts in Acts 16 when we began the we sections, and the author, whoever he happens to be, is identifying with the story. It becomes his story, and the language shifts, and the changes. I think the Book of Acts. I think that there are sources for the Book of Acts, again, whether we're talking about oral traditions, written traditions, but I think certainly there's a definite linguistic shift. And when we're looking at expressions, it's interesting. Oftentimes we'll find that they're appearing in Hebraic expressions showing up in Luke, in the early part of Acts. And then when you go into what we call second Acts, they just either disappear or they'll be Hellenized. And again, I think that the challenge is these are not, and I'll repeat, the explanation has been that these are quote unquote Septuagintalisms. And that comes because most New Testament scholars I encounter do not know Hebrew sufficiently enough to know that you have post-biblical Hebraisms. I'll give you one out of Matthew. It speaks when Jesus, we were talking about the account of Matthew 16, when Jesus says, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. That expression, basar v'dam, in Hebrew means a human being. That is not a Greek expression. Doesn't appear in Greek literature, doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible. The first time it appears is Min Sira in post-biblical Hebrew. But it's an expression, that if you go and you look in Tobit and Ben Sira and some of these, we start finding these early post-biblical expressions that find their way into the Gospels. They're not part of any attempt to biblicize Luke's Greek. He's retaining from the sources he's getting material that is Hebraic. But yeah, I would say that they continue. My reading of it is they continue through Luke up through through Acts 15.
So before we close, I just want to tell everybody real quick, but the links to purchase both volumes, Jesus' Last Week, will be in the description below and the pinned comment. Included will also be the link to the Jerusalem Perspective website as well. If that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Professor Stephen Notley.
Thank you for having me. Right.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.